might start by saying I find myself in a very alarming situation this afternoon because I'm entirely surrounded by lawyers. And however, I think 4 lawyers to 1 philosopher is about the right ratio, so it should be okay. But more seriously, I'm really delighted that we are able to have a close look at this very dramatic development here in Singapore with the bill which has been enacted and will come into force in some time. I think this is a great opportunity for us, this particular event, to just have a look at it, both in terms of our own views and questions from the perspective of those of you who work in the IRB system or as researchers here in Singapore, but also to have the benefit of the perspectives from other countries. So we have, of course, on the panel, I don't really think I need to introduce everyone because you've met them all before, but just to briefly along them. So on the panel we have Prof. Chalmers from Australia, and then we have, of course, Associate Prof. Chan from here, and then my left, Sumi from here, and then Ryuichi Prof. Ida from Japan. But in addition to that, our other speakers will also be available to comment, so we can also have a perspective from the United States and from Europe, and particularly the Netherlands, and from France, although I don't actually see, is he here? Anyway, he may have gone out. The French do start the weekend fairly early. Très gentil, magnifique. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask Don and Ryuichi first, just to give their perspective on our act from the point of view of the situation in their country, and just to do some comparisons, and also any detailed issues they would like to raise. And then I will give Tracy and Sumi a chance to respond to that or to add any points from the earlier discussion. After that, I then want to open it up to the audience, and I'd be very keen for comments both from our overseas guests and also from those of you involved in the HBR scene here in Singapore. One practical point is that because of the layout on the platform with the need to have these microphones up here, I will ask you, if you want to make a comment or ask a question from the audience, to go to one of the 2 standing microphones in the 2 aisles of the room, so we can hear your questions and comments. So that's really by way of introduction. So Don, could I just ask you to start us off?
Well, I started in preparing for this seminar, which, may I incidentally say, has been extraordinarily enjoyable, and thank you all very much indeed for contributions, because I think it's been very enjoyable personally. But on the work level, I felt, looking at this preparation about consent, it seemed silly not to say something about such a major piece of legislation. And for those that attended my talk, I think I would say we're watching the regulatory pendulum in your country. That regulatory pendulum, in my view, is a matter of policy, and it strikes me that your country and government has decided that you are part of this new biotechnology strategy. You see yourselves as driving that knowledge value industry, and in that case I think you've decided that you need regulation in human tissue and biomedical research. I think that's quite bold, because many other countries like Australia have chosen to have human tissue in one act because there's a generic group of issues there, and we still have some legislation in the case of biomedical research, but it's still generally under National Health and Medical Research Council guidelines, but we are a federal system, and it's neither one nor the other. I think we must always be contextually driven. I think at the moment, I still feel that some of the reading of the Act, like my colleagues Tracy and Sumi, every time you look at it, you find something new. It is a very complicated piece of legislation, but its intention, I think, is quite clear. I think it intends to put research in this country at the forefront of protection of research participants. Can I also say that I was extremely encouraged by the member of your government department, Ms. Philomena Tong, when she replied to a question which seemed to be in exactly the terms that I've understood your legislation. I saw that in various cases, this is not the final word. There will be regulations, codes of conduct, which will spell out some of the detail. That will obviously be in close consultation with the institutions, the researchers, the institutional ethics committees and IRBs. And that seems that there is therefore a very new opening, and I think the Centre should be complimented for having the foresight to set up such an institution as this, for people to hopefully feel a sense of confidence that this is something which can be designed. But I think quite clearly there's a statement not at the price of the research participants. The protection of the participants is at the forefront. So I would look forward to seeing the development of a very fine regulatory system in the interests of research, researchers, research institutions, but primarily the participants. Thank you.
Thank you, Don, and Ryuichi, if you would like to add some comments now. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this very precious panel. And I'm from the country where the law is disliked by everybody, not only by scientists. So that in the research field, the scientists are always claiming the freedom of research. Freedom of research. Research is free, and no regulation, no legislation at all. So I'm a little envy of the Singapore decision to make this kind of act on biomedical research. Since I'm a lawyer, I don't think I like law, but I know the importance and utility of legal regulations. And as far as the human being is concerned, I think the law is necessary when the body as well as the health of human being is concerned. So I would like to congratulate the enactment of this Human Biomedical Research Act. However, I have certain reservations on this act at this stage because as Don has already spoke out, that we should have some regulations or guidelines. The most important thing for an enactment in biomedical research, well, probably not only biomedical research, but in research, in scientific research in general, there are 3 points. One, interpretation should be easy for scientists, not only for lawyers. And 2, the understanding of the articles or phrases in the law should be easy. And the the third, the implementation by scientists should be also easy. From this point of view, I don't see the, easy implementation is right now possible with this act, because the law is very complicated, in a sense very precise in certain parts, and in some other parts the law is probably too simple. So we need probably the regulation for implementation of this law, and not only regulation but also the guidelines and probably question and answers. The question will be posed by a scientist, and the Minister of Health should give answers, or clear answers for the interpretation, understanding, and implementation. Shall we go to a precise point, or okay? Well, you start. Let's go.
I think what we'll do is we'll state the general view of the Act first, and then maybe we can pick up some particular points. So our overseas colleagues are being, of course, very polite and nice to us, which we would expect. But I think if I read between the lines, Don has described this as brave. He may be wondering if it's foolhardy. And Ryuichi has said it's a very welcome act, but it may be very hard to implement. And I think the anxiety about the act is very evident among the research community still, despite the excellent work by the ministry in consulting and listening, as we heard earlier, and modifying in response to feedback. But there's still an atmosphere of nervousness, I think, about the legislation. And I also would be very interested to hear how the IRB people, many of you in the room, feel about it, whether you have concerns about this shift in the environment in terms of now a piece of legislation that will determine your activities. So I think it might be interesting just to, before we go to details, just to get a little more feedback on that. And so is there anyone, now let me remind you, you need to come up to the microphone, but is there anyone in the audience who would like just to add to these general comments about your perspective on the Act, whether you feel comfortable with it, whether there are concerns that you have about it? Okay, so given that nobody is wanting to say anything at this point, maybe I could ask Sumi and Tracy just to comment on this general question of the notion of an overarching act. I should mention that this idea of having different legislation for tissue and other health research is also true of the United Kingdom. So we have a Human Tissue Act which covers the use of tissue, and especially after several scandals we had in Britain about the abuses of human tissue. But we have no similar overarching legislation covering the whole area of research ethics. So Sumi, what would you like to say on this general point about the Act itself?
Well, I think it's excellent that we're looking in terms of developing a framework to protect research subjects, but do it in a way, obviously, that's still the goal of still promoting research. I think one of the main concerns I have, just as a layperson, maybe not so much looking at it from a scientific point of view, but just thinking about it in terms of Singapore still lacking any provisions that protect individuals from discrimination in terms of genetic information. So obviously, we have a lot of data and material about people, and I think it's a very real concern on the person on the ground that they not be deprived of a job or livelihood, or their family not be stigmatized in some way because the results of whatever it is that their blood or their tissue reveals a condition that may impact the family. So if we're thinking about protecting research participants, I would really like that sort of legislation or regulation or guideline to very clearly come through.
Oh, okay, that's fine. And Tracy, speaking neither in your capacity as a former employee of the ministry, nor in your capacity as a member of the law faculty, but simply as yourself, what thoughts have you got?
Okay, speaking generally, I suppose today's session may not have been the ideal way in which to present the sort of actual impact of legislation. But simple reason is that because the Act, a lot of the Act intends to cover a very wide array of activities. A lot of details have not been worked out yet. So that's the first point, right? That this is not the final chapter, but is an important step that has been taken. Okay, and actually, if you look at the core requirements in the main legislation, they boil down to very basic things that those who are familiar with this kind of system, it sort of enforced self-regulation, right? The regulator cannot possibly understand every single type of research and what the ethics are, but it sets up processes and it leaves it to institutions to govern their research activities ethically, right? So that's the first point. The second point is, in a sense, as a lawyer, there's always this tension about making things easy to understand and therefore also having to make certain trade-offs in terms of specificity or accuracy in terms of what can and cannot be done operationally. So there's always going to be a certain amount of interpretation that is required. But here's some of the things that I think are a good reason why we needed this legislation. One, because I think sometimes IRBs are applying foreign law when that's not the law in Singapore. There are certain basic questions about, what is the basic legal rights of a minor, of an adult without capacity, or even someone with capacity. We needed some clear answers, and we didn't have them until this Act was passed. Of course, there are still interpretational issues, but as I said, this is an ongoing process. I think the second one is that as a regulator also, the concern was with having enough tools to deal with potential problems downstream when, while a lot of research is happening with government money and within government institutions, there is a substantial portion that is not. And nothing within the existing regulatory frameworks could effectively deal with that kind of activity in the private sector especially. From my perspective, we just don't know what's going on outside the realms in which we are very familiar with, right? So the Act was intended to basically provide some basic protections for people who deal with private sector institutions, who are not obliged to comply with professional guidelines, medical guidelines, or hospital regulations, period. There was basically no regulation in that respect. So I think that it's important to have something there. If I were, for example, a research participant. So I mean, probably as a matter of general comments, that is what I would say. But yeah, I suppose we could always say something could have been clearer.
Yeah, I think that last point you made is very important indeed, because the whole idea of the scope of the Act is, I think, a huge step forward in terms of the amount of different places that are doing research in Singapore, they will all have to conform to the standards that we already know have been met by a lot of our institutions up till now without the need of an act to ensure that that happens. But I think the coverage and the definition that crosses several different types of institution and brings them all under a single umbrella with the same principles, especially the protection of the human subject as the very first and central principle, primary principle is a huge, in my opinion, a huge step forward. Maybe I could ask Ryuichi if she would like to bring up some of the more detailed issues that you wanted to raise.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, I have several points to say. The first one is the when I read this bill, the distinction between the material and data is not very clear, because this act is speaking about the material, and well, as far as I understand, if it is correct, as far as I understand, the data will be protected by the Data Protection Act. So it should be very clear what is the relation between this act and the Data Protection Act when it is related to the data taken from human biological materials. Of course, the identifiability is probably the criteria of the what I say, the pertinence to Data Protection Act and this act. However, probably for the scientist, it is not so easy to distinguish this data is go to there and that data is go to this act and so on. Because the identifiability is sometimes questionable because when we speak about the biobank, you have the materials as well as the genetic data in particular in the biobank and the genetic database. And in the biobank, the data is identifiable or coded, so what we call linkable. However, the data and the materials may go out from the biobank or from not the biobank, but the research institution who collected the materials or data for their own research may go out from that institution without, of course, the code, without the identifying tools for these materials and data. Then the receiving institution, the receiving institution may do research with unidentifiable data for their institution, but sometimes they need some other or information, health information or some other information, and may ask to the biobank or to the original institution. In such a case, I don't know exactly how this act is applicable or not applicable, and how the data is protected through the Data Protection Act, and so on. That is my first point. And the second point is that I think in the section 3, the meaning of human biomedical research. In the human biomedical research, the research intended to study the prevention and so on. So the health-related research is included in this act, but you can use human biological material for other research than health purposes. So for example, sorry.
Give an example.
Yeah, for example, sometimes in the faculty or the faculty of science, well, biology or life science faculty may use human biological materials in order to analyze the tissues or cells not for the health purpose, but biological purposes. I mean, scientific purposes, not related to health. In this case, is this act will apply to or not? According to this article, such a non-health related research is not covered by this act. It means that the human biological materials, even it is identifiable, but not related to health, may be research for free research. But perhaps it's a little extraordinary case imaged, but well, reading this act may be possible. Because, well, nowadays, even in the human biomedical research, there are not only medical doctors, but also, and in particular, PhDs, I mean, the scientists. And for example, in Japan, Dr. Nakatsuji, who made for the first time in Japan the embryonic stem cells, he is a scientist. He is always looking at new invention or new discovery in biological science, I mean life science. And he's always speaking about the new scientific development. But, well, I'm not criticizing Dr. Nakatsuji, but Professor Yamanaka is always talking about the patients. He made iPSL for the patients. And Dr. Nakatsuji made ESL because he's interested in embryonic stem cells or pluripotentiality of the cell. That is slightly different. The result may be the same, but slightly different. And if you limit the human biomedical research for the intention of health-related research, I think it's a little narrow or too narrow, because you have many kinds of research using human biological materials. I have some more.
Maybe we'll pick up. Let's pick up those two first. So the first is about is the relationship between materials and data clear, or is there potential for uncertainty or confusion here? Who would like to respond to this? Sumi? Tracy?
I think part of the challenge is because for data, both the Human Biomedical Research Act and the Personal Data Protection Act potentially have regulatory influence on the collection of data and the use of data. I think the Act the HBRA tries to minimize that by aligning the broad definition of what is individually identifiable data. The real challenge is actually applying it to human biological materials. Now, if you go to the PDPA Council Advisory Guidelines, there are guidelines on how you decide whether something is personal data, or in the HBRA, individually identifiable, right? And they have certain tests and suggestions. The challenge, I think, for the HBRA is to translate that for tissue. And under what circumstances are you going to be satisfied that tissue is not individually identifiable in a certain context? And this relates to issues about how likely is it that the researchers that use the tissue are going to be able to re-identify, and that really depends on what information we think they are likely to have access to in order to re-identify human tissue. So, in a sense, it is confusing because the legislation has intervened into this area at different points in time and looking at different aspects of human biomedical research, right? So data, a huge set of policy decisions were taken under the PDPA, and now we come in and the HBRA adds on human tissue to the equation. And yes, it is not as clear as we would want to be, but in a sense, I'm not sure the answers are immediately available that we can make it crystal clear without any confusion, especially for human tissue, and when we are satisfied that something is not individually identifiable. So in that sense, if you notice, nothing in the Act actually, the guidelines are not out yet on how we're going to decide when tissue is sufficiently not identifiable to fall out of scope or not to require certain regulatory protections. Yeah.
Let me play devil's advocate and say, I didn't actually say the Act was brave, I said it was bold. Can I first of all ask how many people are familiar with the Australian expression FIFO? Those are workers who fly in and fly out. I should also remember I'm flying in and flying out, and I will be as polite as I possibly can. No, seriously, I think this is one of the bold parts of it. At one stage historically, privacy was intended to cover our government records, our bank records, and so on. Originally, most countries, when they were coming up with privacy acts, were going to exclude medical research, and we were one of those countries. We simply said medical research is something which should be regulated within that sector itself. How much has the world changed now? The amount of information which is now kept in electronic form, and our country at the moment is now looking at a system of linking electronic health records to the whole series of other life form and information to try to get pictures of what is actually happening in the health sector. And in research, as I said in my talk yesterday, it is no longer simply looking at genetic data, which was created by projects such as the Human Genome Project. That now has to be linked to lifestyle and health data to actually start informing the translational process. So in many ways, your country, having decided to put the tissue and the data together, has a great deal of interesting logic. So it is, in some ways, bold and experimental, and I think it's incumbent on all of those that are here today, representing research institutions, ethics review committees, and researchers. You have the government department giving an undertaking that there will be consultation. That obviously is unfortunately saying that there will be more work on you, because not only will you be doing your work in those organisations, you will also be thinking about the terms of this legislation, the terms of the guidelines when those come out, and the codes of conduct, which you will be able to try, hopefully, to form and shape. But you will have to keep this through, because there's not many countries around the world, you may be the only one, I think, so far, that's gone down this track, but there is an underlying technological imperative, because so much is now being kept on electronic format. So that is something which I think I would look at. The two specific things which I would say, one, as I put in the slide yesterday, felt that minimal risk and waiver, those to me are very conservative. That's a good way to start. Our country has, I think, slightly more liberal. We tend to have a test which says, is it in the public interest? Yes, we keep an audit of all the research ethics committees that give waiver. We make sure we're checking them centrally so that people are not being too lenient. I think at the moment you may find, as you go into practice, that those might be a little bit tight. But again, I take Philomena Tong's comments that is able to be consulted and fed back to the legislation or into the guidelines and codes of conduct to look at that. And the second is, I think, very important in that process of consultation, as I said yesterday, Professor Hans Delden and the CIOM's organisation and many other international organisations spend a lot of time thinking about international guidelines. Singapore will be producing research for the international market, and if that is the case, I think that question of consistency of guidelines and practices, not doing the same thing, consistent with international best practice. And I gave you a very brief example yesterday that we were very conscious when we were forming our guidelines of the many links between our researchers around the world, with America, with Canada, with Europe, and we had to, as we were drawing up our guidelines, make sure we were not putting guidelines in place that were going to be inconsistent with those international standards. So that's the other thing that I think is, again, I'm sorry, putting extra work on all of you. If you see some inconsistency, how can that be addressed to make sure that you are facilitating the research, but nevertheless protecting the participants? And I expect, as everything in your country, to try to ensure that you're reaching international best practice. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'm going to come to the second point in a minute that Prof. Ida raised. But I think this is a really very important discussion because, I mean, to use a phrase that's rather overused, the devil is in the detail. But the thing is, what we'll know better whether we have difficulties and problems, as you've commented, and Tracy as well, when we begin to look at actually how you spell this out in terms of the operationalizing of some of these broad things in the Act, whether these are guidelines or regulations or however they're done. And so this is a real opportunity, I think, for us to continue the discussion and involve all interested parties, but particularly the research community and the IRB community in this dialogue. Can I just check if there's anyone that wants to comment on this question of material, tissue and data, and the sometimes complicated relationship between the two? I don't want to stop anything from the audience. Hans, did you? I'm afraid you have to walk, which is a good thing on Friday afternoon. So we're thinking about your health. Go ahead.
Thank you. I'll keep walking. I'm just going to say that indeed also in the CIOMS guidelines we're actually treating them almost similarly because tissue, I mean what we take from tissue is data. That's what we would use it for. So I begin to see less and less the relevance of taking these two things differently. Of course, there is a difference in that tissue may be analyzed in different ways in the future and therefore may even contain more data than data, if you can follow me. But still, I think the general approach should be rather similar, and that's what we've done in CIOMS.
That's very helpful, thank you. So, Sumi, do you want to take on this definitional question? So, just to remind you of the second point that Prof. Ida raised, which is that it would appear as though even identifiable human material might be used in what we might call basic science research that would fall outside the definition of what's covered in the Act.
I think that's always the problem with definitions, isn't it? But you have to draw the line somewhere, and you have have to create the words to cover. I think the bottom line is, are participants being put at risk by them not falling on, this sort of research, by them not falling under this sort of legislation. And again, I think there are going to be, and this is the thing about the definition, and I think we're actually going to be doing this in our workshops, is coming up with a series of different types of studies that are on the borderline of whether they fall in or fall outside of the definition of HBR. And I think that in itself may be challenging in some cases. But yeah, I think it ultimately boils down to ensuring that participants are protected. But just to give you one or two examples, that for example, if you're conducting research where you're interviewing participants who are terminally ill and their family members about decision making, that arguably doesn't fall under the current definition of human biomedical research, because you're not alleviating, preventing, you're not conducting that sort of type research. You're not, oh my goodness, I can't even get the words out of my head. It's a Friday afternoon feeling. Okay, because it's not intended to study the prevention, prognostication, diagnosis, alleviation of the disease, and all that. And you're not subjecting them to any intervention that causes these sorts of effects, a physical, physiological effect. Now, there could be other types of research that arguably may not fall into the definition. Perhaps certain types of sports research could be on the borderline, possibly depending on what sort of effect you might bring about with the participant. But yeah, no, I take your point that I think not everything is going to fall in. It's just going to be a question of applying the definition, and perhaps there'll be some more guidance in the regulations. We're not sure that may be able to narrow this down a little bit.
Thank you. I think I'm just watching out for anyone wanting to comment, but if not, could I? Yes, Tracy.
Right. Sorry. On the definitional scope of the Act, I just wanted to point out that, I don't think I'm in a position to say, well, this is the reason why the lines were drawn this way. But anyone just reading the Act, one important consideration was probably that let's not bite off more than we can chew at this stage. Because one important thing is that the Act doesn't cover a lot of the social sciences, which it may in other jurisdictions. So it might be a practical thing about what can we manage at this time, and so we draw certain boundaries. They may not be rooted in pure logic. The second point, and an important one to remember, is that the scope is different depending on which part of the Act you look at. When we're talking about human biomedical research, consent, IRB review, and so forth, there's a certain section 3 that defines that. But for collection of human tissue for research, their research is research, not human biomedical research. So if I'm going to collect a tissue sample for some pure study, the consent requirements would apply in that context, right? So again, you have to, unfortunately, the Act marries a lot of different things in one document. You've got to be careful about what the activity is that you're looking at. It does cover research in general, especially for the collection and storage of tissue. But if you're going to go into an intervention or data analysis and that sort of thing, then a more narrow definition of research applies, right? So just the caution is be careful that you have the right working definition when you're looking at a particular activity. If you're collecting tissue, storing it, very broad definition of research. If you're conducting human biomedical research requiring IRB review, then a more narrow definition applies.
That was a very important clarification. Yes, please. Would you mind going to a microphone? I'm sorry about this, but it's the only way to deal with it. Thank you.
Hi. Hello.
Hi, good afternoon. I'd just like to add on to what Tracy has said. It's true that the Act has two different frameworks, and just like to come back to the question that was raised earlier before the break on whether DNA is covered by the Act. DNA material itself is not biological material. Actually, if you read the Act, the definition of biological material is actually any material that consists of or includes human cells. So, cell membrane, organelles, or derivatives of cells are not considered as biological So while they're not actually covered by the human tissue framework of the Human Biomedical Research Act, it could potentially fall under the Human Biomedical Research Framework, because the genetic information that you extract from the DNA material could potentially be identifiable. And if it is identifiable and it is for a purpose that is specified in Section 3 of the Human Biomedical Research Act, then it is considered human biomedical research, and the researchers will have to comply with the requirements of this Act. I just like to make this clear for everyone. Thanks.
But it has to be research, right?
Okay, so it turns out that some things that may appear to, as it were, go on, escape, are actually captured if you look carefully at the different aspects of the legislation. Before we go on to some other points that Ryuichi may wish to raise, can I go back to the point that Don made about minimal risk as being quite conservative here, that, and also the waiver, these things. If I could trouble you, Ruth, I wonder how does this compare with the U.S. approach to these issues of risk and waiver? Can you give some comment on that?
Well, let me start by saying that this act in Singapore is way ahead of what we have in the United States, but it's coming. There is a proposal right now, it's actually on the table, to include all of this information about genetics and tissue and data, et cetera, and incorporate those into the federal guidelines. Right now they don't exist at all, and this will be the first revision since 1991 of the U.S. federal regulations. They are regulations, there's not a law, it's not an act, it comes from the Department of Health and Human Services. So this is to commend Singapore on being ahead of the United States in this regard. According to the existing and also future U.S. federal regulations, a variety of research that is minimal risk can be expedited. That doesn't mean there can be a waiver, necessarily a waiver of consent, but it can be expedited. And that's just a much simpler procedure. It still has to go before the IRB, but the chair or the chair's designee can approve the research if it's judged to be minimal risk. And it's represented by the researcher, by the investigator as minimal risk, and then whoever reviews it on behalf of the IRB has to agree that it's minimal risk. Examples are given in the U.S. federal regulation for what constitutes minimal risk. The definition is there, almost identical to what's stated in the Act as minimal risk. And then there are specific examples that are given. There's a separate provision as far as waiver of consent is concerned. The only circumstances under which, the way it reads is something like the following: the IRB may waive some or all of the elements of informed consent as long as the following conditions obtain. One of those conditions is that the research be minimal risk. But normally, and so it's one or all of the following, but simply being minimal risk is insufficient for a waiver of consent. So for example, taking blood is an example of, it's usually a certain small amount of blood, is an example of a minimal risk procedure. But just because it's minimal risk does not justify a waiver of consent. So usually there have to be other circumstances that would lead to a waiver of consent. And that goes to the phrase that was one of the previous speakers referred to, impracticable to obtain consent. Other examples would be the type of research in which to reveal the purpose would bias the research. And then the one that I've always found a little bit problematic is, and the failure to obtain consent will not violate the rights or welfare of the human subject. well, if you think that there's a right to informed consent for whatever is done, then the waiver of consent violates those rights. So I've often found that one a little bit problematic. The short answer is there can be waivers. Minimal risk is a necessary condition, but normally not sufficient. And I think there can be some misunderstanding, because anything that does involve a minimal invasion of the human body would surely always require informed consent of the subject.
Thank you. Don't leave the microphone just yet. I mean, it's very, very nice to hear that that Singapore is ahead. But there is another distinction, isn't there, if I understand it, which is that all of this regulation applies only to federally funded research.
The new, well, I have two things to say about that. The new proposed regulations will broaden that to be all research.
Oh, good.
Yes.
Yeah,
So that's a major change.
Huge step forward. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
But the other, which may be poorly understood, I don't mean you understand it poorly, but may in general be poorly understood, is all research in the United States, and actually foreign research as well, that uses federal funds from the United States, all research has to get what is called a federal-wide assurance. That is obtained from the oversight agency, the OHRP, the Office of Research Protection, that was mentioned several times in the last couple of days. So every IRB that exists that, again, still currently uses federal funds has to get this federal-wide assurance, as it's called. So that means that the oversight agency, the OHRP, actually oversees and can stop research, can make certain requirements about research. So one of the conditions that exists in this federal-wide assurance is that the IRB will review all research that comes before it if the IRB receives federal funds. So assuming, I mean, if the institution receives federal funds, but they all receive federal funds. We're not of course talking about pharmaceutical companies, because they're under the FDA regulations, but also under the common rule. So every institution, a hospital receives federal funds because it has Medicare and Medicaid for patients. So it's any federal funds. So in de facto, with the exception, of course, of the pharmaceutical industry, but for any institution that receives federal funds, not only for research, but any other purpose, has to represent that the IRB in the institution reviews all research that comes before it, whether it's federally funded or not. So de facto, IRBs that are doing their job properly in the United States do review all research because they almost all receive federal funds. So I hope that clarifies a little bit. But the new regulations require that all research that's done anywhere will have to be compliant with whether it's federal funded or not.
Thank you. Thank you. That is very helpful. Thank you. So, Don.
Could I just thank Professor Macklin for very crisply explaining that, because if you remember, she said infringing the rights. That's the expression that you've included in your current formulation. It was the express terms that we decided to exclude from our statement because we thought it rather vague, as you just hinted at, and we prefer this standard on expedited review as also encapsulating this idea of outweighing the private being outweighed by the public interest in the research. So that's why I think it may sound like playing with words, but in practical terms, we felt that was allowing the research to give good grounds why this was important in the public interest and could be subject to expedited waiver.
Sorry, yes, the waiver provisions in the schedule are influenced by the common rule, but our phrase is slightly different. It says would not otherwise affect. It recognizes the inherent conflict in the common rule, so what it says is it will not otherwise affect your rights and interests.
Well, my next question relates to, well, 2 points. One is relating to the IRB. The other is the whole framework of research using human materials. As far as the IRB is concerned, I think the articles concerning the Interinstitutional Review Board in Part 4 is very precise, so that I hope that the IRB works very well on this, basing on these articles. However, I have 2 points to give you a remark. The one is the quality of review is not assured with these articles. You have a very precise article on appointment, composition, or functions, and quorum or procedures, conflict of interest, and so on. However, even these conditions are fully obtained, the discussion as well as the result, the outcome of the review is not always assured. Well, my second point relates to also on this point, because in these articles, the review should be done on ethical grounds. There are 2 positions in which the one is to say that the ethics review or IRB should done not only on ethical ground, but also from scientific grounds, so that the review should be done from both scientific and ethical review, ethical ground. That is one opinion. The other is, of course, the review should be done only on ethical grounds. However, I often say that bad science is bad ethics. So that if a protocol is scientifically bad or not appropriate, the protocol itself is unethical. Even if, for example, the informed consent is appropriately obtained and so on. And well, from Japanese experience, when we talk about ethical point of view in the IRB, the members are always thinking about almost only on the informed consent and not for other aspects. So that the stress should be, of course, given on ethical ground, but the scientific ground should not be forgotten. That is my point. So the quality of how Singapore will go to assure the quality of the view, even if the members are well qualified. And the second point is rather very general. You have different kinds of researches using human materials, not only biomedical materials. For example, non-identifiable human materials used in health research, and non-identifiable materials used in non-health research, and human identifiable cells or tissues used in health research as well as in non-health research. So you have different kinds of researches using human materials with different objectives or different goals. And so, however, this act is only concerning to the human biomedical research. And I think it is probably necessary to make a kind of general framework of which kind of research is going to this field and the other research is going to field, and only the human biomedical research is covered by this act, and the other things will be covered by guidelines or freedom of research and so on. Otherwise, sometimes the outcome given by the non-health related research in biological department using human materials may be used or may be asked to use in a research with the intention of disease prevention or something like that. So that the combination after the research, the data will be used. After the research, the data will be used together with the health-related research, so that the the threshold of different research should be clearly designed, and the combination or relation of these different fields may be clearly written out. Otherwise, researchers may be confused whether my research is under this act or my research is totally free to use everything, non-identifiable data and so on. So I'm always thinking about the capacity of, I'm sorry to say, but the capacity of scientists to understand the legal words and the laws.
Thank you very much. So there are 3 points there. One is about looking not only at the formal setup of the committee and so on, but the quality of the reviewer. I'd like to comment on that one. The second one was the science ethics question about the scope of the review by the IRB, and the third one is about the clarity from the point of view of researchers about what is or is not covered by this particular bit of legislation. So on the first point, on this question of quality of the work of IRBs, I think not everyone here may be aware that the Ministry has set up a special national committee, the National Ethics Capability Committee, which is chaired by the former Director of Medical Services, Prof. Satku. And this committee has a very wide scope in terms of looking at national ethics capability across all health professions, but in addition to that, looking at the area of ethics capability in IRBs or in health research generally. And so this will definitely be looking at quality of the reviews, not simply whether they fit formal criteria or process criteria. And that's work in progress at the moment. Our centre is involved in this, both providing the secretariat, and also I'm the vice chair, and Dr. Jacqueline Chin is the secretary of the committee. But we have been in active discussion with colleagues in the IRB scene about the whole question of definition of core competencies and so on, both for chairs, members of IRBs and so on. So watch this space. There's going to be some interesting things coming out in the future in relation to quality of review. So who would like to comment on the science ethics one?
So in terms of what specifically IRBs should do when they review protocols, I mean, those details are not out yet. But if you look at the prior MOH governance framework and the operational guidelines, the recommendation is that the IRB is not principally responsible for scientific merit or review of scientific merit. So that's the starting point. So what I do understand is that there was quite heated debate prior to that governance framework about whether or not IRB should review scientific merit, along the same tensions I think that other speakers have mentioned in other jurisdictions. So the way I would read it is that the existing Ministry of Health Governance framework does not expect IRBs to do so, but it doesn't say they should not do so. So if for example, the protocol has already undergone peer review for funding purpose, then there may not be a compelling reason to revisit those issues. But if it has not, there's nothing in the governance framework to stop the IRB from asking those questions. And also, I'm sure there would be also an exception that if you think that a particular aspect of the methodology has an ethical implication, then I don't see anything in the governance framework that prevents the IRB from opening that question. And if there's disagreement, they may have to refer it to a scientific peer review committee. Well, the current scope is drawn out. How we interpret what falls in and what falls out depends, but ultimately, my own take is it's a pragmatic step forward rather than saying we're going to govern everything and do everything all at once.
Just very quickly again about quality assurance and the work of the NECC. The Act actually has 2 pages worth of what they're likely to be publishing in regulations, the topics and areas, and one of them includes quality assurance.
Yeah, accreditation and quality. Yeah. So we're nearing the end of the session. I'm going to ask my panel if there are any other comments they wish to make. Then I'll invite any further questions or comments from the audience, and then I'll ask Dr. Tong to make any comments she would like to make before the session ends. So can I just go along to anyone?
I would certainly like to ask a question. One of the things which I said is this seems to be a very bold new start, and like Professor Macklin, it is a world first, and there's obviously going to be a very big agenda. The undertaking of the ministry is that they will be listening to the feedback. Now, as I understand it, Sumi has just foreshadowed 2 specific workshops about the Act, and no doubt there will be ideas coming up. And as people start ferreting in on long evenings when there's nothing much on the television to look at, and you start reading this Act, but on a serious side, things will come up. So my question is your centre going to have a program of trying to run these workshops, assemble the various comments, hear comments coming from researchers, from institutions, so that you actually have some systematic way in which these issues can be addressed? Because it seems to me that, yes, it would be very good if everyone in this room, in the various representatives as institutions, IRBs and researchers, but I do think it's one of those things that it would be better to be done in an organised fashion so that it's systematically handled.
I didn't pay him to ask that question, or even suggest he ask the question. But let me say that we are looking forward to continuing to work alongside the ministry in this, because we've had a great partnership up till now, and in any way that we can assist in the process, we certainly will be glad to do. I'm sure there'll be other procedures the minister wants to follow in terms of getting feedback and looking at drafting, but the centre is certainly very keen to be part of this. Thank you. And I will say a little about future events at the end of the conference.
Sorry, again, because I'm assuming a lot of IRB members are here, or chairs. Sumi raised an issue earlier, which maybe I just mentioned, that she was concerned about potential inconsistency or tension between the Mental Capacity Act when we make decisions for adults lacking capacity and when we make decisions under the context of the HBRA. Actually, embedded in the Act actually are some consequential amendments that have sought to harmonize the position so that when you're making research decisions for adults without capacity, then the requirements under the HBRA will apply and not the general MCA framework, right? So that has been clarified. Yeah, that's all.
Could you now express your thanks to the 4 members of the panel, because we're moving on to the closing session. So I'm not going to give a long speech. I'm just going to make a few concluding remarks, just to say that this has been a great event as far as I'm concerned. We're very much looking forward to your feedback. But I'm aware from the atmosphere and the excitement in the room over 2 days that clearly we have managed to strike the right note for you, at least at times, and we will do our best in the future to take note of your comments about improvements that might be made, because this is an ongoing process and one that we are delighted to be involved in as the Center for Biomedical Ethics here in Singapore. Of course, as I said earlier, we are really pleased to be working as partners with the Ministry of Health and with the National Medical Research Council, and that work will continue. The only other thing I would mention is that there are two developments to tell you about right away. The first is that we've set up an informal, but I think very important committee. It's a committee we're calling CORE, Committee on Research Ethics. And this is the chairs and or their representatives and the administrators, if they wish to attend, of all the IRBs that we have been able to identify and contact here in Singapore. And we had the first meeting of CORE at lunchtime yesterday. And the very interesting thing about this group is that it brings together people that would not have been together before, because we have, of course, the people from the 2 health clusters and the very established systems there, but also from about 4 or 5 of our educational institutions, universities and technical colleges and the whole range of places that have to set up or may be wishing to set up under the new Act, IRBs, and plus the private sector in the hospital scene. And so this is an opportunity to share. It's not a formal committee. It's a get-together. It's a networking. It allows your chairs or their representatives to exchange experiences, but also it will be a channel of feedback to the ministry, I'm sure, in terms of the way in which the old established IRBs and the newly establishing ones are finding the new environment and the Act. We won't be meeting that frequently, probably just about 3 times a year, but we will, we believe, be helping in this whole process of making sure that it's not just top-down, but that we are getting feedback up as well, and that we are learning from each other, as I believe we did in the last 2 days. So that's the first thing to mention. Secondly, although this is not a definite date yet, but I believe you will all be on our mailing list, and if you're not, do speak to the Secretariat and leave your name card or whatever. We're probably planning another event in the beginning of next year. At the moment, the tentative date is the 18th of February, but that's not yet confirmed. But this will be the first of a series of workshops that we will be running, aiming not at a large conference like this one, but really at more focused topic area groups and in specific topics and issues that we believe you'll be confronting. So just keep an eye on your emails, because we'll keep you up to date with these plans as these get formulated. I've also been asked whether a conference of this scale is likely to be offered again in future years, and it's a Scottish answer. If we have the money, we'll run the conference. So let me finish by, again, thanking all of you for your participation and wishing you all the best. Thank you very much indeed.